Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So I've just taken, in fact yesterday, receipt of an interesting antique sword that I thought I'd just talk a little bit about. First thing to say is it's in fairly dirty condition, I would call it. Dirty rather than bad. It's not in fundamentally bad condition, but a lot of antique swords will come in what I would call a dirty condition. That is, they need cleaning, but they're not fundamentally in a bad condition. You know, this sword is solid, it's all in one piece, it doesn't have serious pitting. What is pitting? Pitting is essentially when a blade or any other part of an iron parts of a sword rusts. The rust kind of eats into the blade like acid, essentially. It's actually eating away, it's feeding on the steel. It's a chemical reaction that happens between essentially water and steel in the air. Interesting point to note, when a sword or any other metal, any other steel object is in water but doesn't have access to oxygen, or not enough oxygen, then actually the rusting process doesn't really happen. So some of the best preserved medieval swords are river-found swords. You might think, why don't they just rust away to nothing? And it's because they go into the silt and the mud in the banks or at the bottom of the river, and it actually doesn't have enough oxygen in it for them to corrode, so that's why they're protected. They get a chemical reaction that they go dark colour, but they don't actually corrode away to nothing if they're protected by the silt. If they just lay in the water, then they would corrode away to nothing, like cannons from a ship, for example. Eventually will just get eaten away to nothing in general. But so anyway, going back to massive diversion there. Going back to the sword, it's essentially in a dirty condition. It needs a damn good clean, and so don't expect it to be shiny and fancy, because this is how it came to me. I need to get to work cleaning it. There's various different ways I will clean it. First of all is to get some oil on the blade, feed the blade a little bit. When blades have got rusty or oxidization on them, and then essentially being in a dry environment subsequently, they get very sort of dry and crusty on the surface, and if you put oil on and leave the oil to soak in for quite a while, it will help when you come to start cleaning the blade. In actual fact, this blade seems to be fairly bright. You can kind of see, so it's got lots of dark patches on. Those dark patches are what remains of, or where there was, either rust or fingerprints. So if people put their fingers on the blade, much like I'm doing at the moment, and then it gets left for a long time, the steel will turn black there. Or equally, if there's rust spots and then the rust is cleaned off, what you're left with underneath is these black marks. Some of those black marks might possibly buff out with a felt or cloth buffing wheel. I will see, or very often they don't come out, but that's no biggie. Antique swords, you have to accept, are old and are not going to look brand new. But it's just generally quite dirty, and it has a brass hilt that would have originally been gilt on top of the brass, and again that could do with a damn good clean. Different people have different ideas about how much you should clean a sword. Some people with brass, for example, will put brass polish on it and polish it up to bright. I sometimes do that if the condition's good. That's how it would have been originally. You're not damaging the brass, but some people prefer an antique to look antique and have original looking patina on it, as it's called. Patina is essentially oxidization. And on a bronze statue, for example, you'd never want to polish a bronze statue, because if you polish a bronze statue, you'll lose that beautiful lustrous brown colour that they have, and you'll bring them up essentially looking a bit like brass, like a slightly different colour than brass, but bright and shiny, and that's not desirable for bronze statues. For sword hilts it's a little bit different, because if a sword has been well looked after and well maintained throughout its life, it will have a shiny brass hilt. So I'm not a sort of a patina Nazi, should we call it, in that I think that if the brass is fundamentally in good condition, there's no reason really not to polish it, in my view, so long as you don't overdo it, so long as you don't damage it and remove any of the etching or decoration or anything like that. The grip is shark skin, as you can see, and it would have been white, bright white originally, and it is quite grubby. I will clean that. However, shark skin is unfortunately quite difficult to clean, and some of the discoloration is essentially just age discoloration. It's not necessarily dirt. However, I have found in the past that using an old toothbrush, not my current used toothbrush, and various other things, even if you just use a bit of soapy water carefully, then you can actually clean up shark skin grips fairly well. Naval swords, unfortunately, or British naval swords at least, and certainly Prussian ones as well, have white grips, which unfortunately don't end up white once they're 100 and whatever years old. Whereas army swords tend to have either dark grey or in fact black originally grips, and so of course actually it's quite good because they don't show up the dirt so much. This has got a lion head pommel, which pretty much most naval officers' swords do in Britain and in Prussia incidentally, and so it's quite dirty. It needs a damn good clean. The inside of the guard is filthy. Just it all needs cleaning. However, I will just say a couple of things that make this sword, in fact 3 things that make this sword very unusual. The first thing is who it belonged to. It belonged to an admiral, Admiral Nugent, who was quite important in World War I. However, I have a theory that it wasn't actually his sword originally. I think it belonged to someone before him because he joined the service in 1892, and I believe this sword is earlier than 1892. I think it's more likely about 1870, something like that. More about that perhaps in the future when I've done a bit more research. However, the 2 features of its design that make it really unusual are, first of all, the blade. It is not the typical 1845, or in the case of the Navy 1846 style blade with a filler. It's what's known as a Toledo blade. Now, Toledo blades, unsurprisingly, are named after a style of blade that was popular in Toledo. They were made in Toledo and used on Spanish swords, and they were emulated on some British special order or custom order officers' swords in Britain. And actually they feature essentially a double-edged blade up here, symmetrical double-edged blades. They're pretty much straight. You do occasionally get what's called a curved Toledo blade, but they're very rare. Slightly more common, though still quite rare, are these straight Toledo blades. So you've got a double-edged blade that's essentially for thrusting. It's a bit like a rapier blade. It's not particularly broad, but it's got the same cross-section as a sort of broadsword. So it's double-edged, edged front and back, symmetrical, straight for the pointy half of the blade, and then the base half of the blade is essentially straight, and it's a bar. You'll notice it's got no edge at all. It's a little bit like the 1892 pattern blade that came in for infantry officers that I've talked about in the past, and you'll notice it has a filler at the front and a filler at the back, and it's symmetrical, and this is what characterises the so-called Toledo blade. And in fact companies like Wilkinson actually sold these blades as an optional different blade that you could have on your sword if you're an officer, and they called it the Toledo blade. And so it's characterised by a blunt first half of the blade for defending, essentially, with a filler at front and back, symmetrical, and then a double-edged straight blade with a nice pointy thrusty end for the second half of the blade. So this is your attacking half of the blade, this is your defending half of the blade. And it seems to have been a fairly popular blade type, and as I mentioned, it's not massively dissimilar to the 1892 pattern of blade that came along a little bit later. And this Toledo style of blade, you will find it sometimes, very occasionally and relatively rarely, on British officers' swords from the Crimean War to about to the 1890s, basically. But they really came in, it seems, in the Crimean War, not much before that, about middle of the 1850s. The second thing which makes this sword different from a normal Royal Navy officer's sword is that it is what's called a patent hilt, or a patent solid hilt. I will make a specific video about patent solid hilts in the future and go into more depth on it, but it's just to say it is a full width tang. So you'll see, you can actually see down there, that is the tang. So much like on a Langsmesser, or indeed on many kitchen knives, the tang is the full width and shape of the grip, much like a Bowie knife, or like many Bowie knives, not all Bowie knives. So the tang is that wide, which obviously makes it, and it's as wide as the base of the blade pretty much, it makes it very, very strong. So this is what I would call a sort of a special regulation officer's fighting sword. It's a blade that they've specifically chosen because it's, they believe, more effective than the standard style of blade, and it's a hilt that's practically indestructible. It's the patent solid hilt, and someone paid quite a lot of money for this sword when it was new. So there we go, guys. I'm going to get to work cleaning it, and hopefully it will look more pretty by the time I'm done. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.